Captain Jake Morrison floated through the airlock and into the dead ship. The metal walls were cold and covered with frost. This was the Harbinger, a warship that Earth had thrown away 15 years ago. Nobody wanted it then because it was too dangerous and too strange. Now Earth needed it desperately, because the aliens were coming and there was nothing else left to try. Jake moved slowly through the dark hallways. His helmet light cut through the darkness and showed him cables hanging from the ceiling and broken panels on every wall. Lieutenant Lisa Chang floated beside him. She was the engineer and her job was to figure out if this old ship could even turn on. Her scanner was beeping with warnings. Everything looked bad. The reactor was dead. The weapons were offline. The life support systems had been stripped for parts years ago. This ship was supposed to save Earth, but it looked more like a floating tomb. Behind them in the cargo hauler, Lieutenant Commander Paul Rodriguez was monitoring their progress. He spoke through the radio and his voice crackled with static. The Valorian Empire fleet would reach Earth in 72 hours. Every defense platform humanity had built was already fighting. Every military ship was already in battle. The Valorians were winning and Earth was running out of time. Jake reached the bridge and turned on his suit lights to full power. The command center was frozen solid. Ice covered every screen and every control panel. The captain's chair sat empty in the middle of the room. It looked like it was waiting for someone brave enough or stupid enough to sit in it. Jake walked around the tactical station and ran his gloved hand over the controls. He had read all the official reports about why this ship was decommissioned. The reports said the Harbinger was unstable. They said it was unpredictable. They said it was too dangerous to use. But Jake knew there was more to the story that the reports did not say. Lisa finally spoke up. She sounded worried. The Harbinger was built around something called the Cascade Drive. It was an experimental weapon that nobody really understood. During the test firing 15 years ago, the weapon had destroyed the target drones completely. There was no debris left behind. There was no radiation. There was no trace that the drones had ever existed at all. The scientists could not explain how the weapon worked. They could not explain where the targets went. Earth Command got scared and decided to lock the ship away and forget about it. Jake thought about that for a moment. A weapon that made things disappear completely sounded exactly like what they needed right now. The Valorian Grand Armada had 300 warships. Each one was bigger and more powerful than anything humans had ever built. Their weapons could cut through Earth's defenses like paper. If the Cascade Drive could make things vanish, then maybe it could make the Valorians vanish too. Over the next 2 days, Jake's small crew of 12 people worked without stopping. They had no time to sleep and barely any time to eat. Engineer Kevin Torres managed to restart the reactor by taking parts from 3 other dead ships in the graveyard. It was not pretty, but it worked. The reactor came online and power started flowing through the Harbinger's systems. Communications officer Nicole Graham got the sensors working enough to see what was happening outside the ship. The sensor array was old and glitchy, but it could track enemy ships and that was all they needed. Weapons specialist Danny Wright spent 6 hours staring at the Cascade Drive controls. The interface was like nothing he had ever seen before. There were readings and numbers that made no sense. There were energy patterns that should not exist according to normal physics. Finally, Danny admitted that he had no idea what half of it meant, but he thought he could make it fire. With 18 hours left before the Valorian fleet arrived, Jake sat in the captain's chair for the first time. The bridge was still cold and dark except for a few running lights. His crew looked exhausted. They had dark circles under their eyes and their uniforms were dirty. But they were still working and that was what mattered. Jake asked for a status report. Lisa checked her tablet and gave him the news. The reactor was running at 40% capacity. That was not great, but it was enough. The shields were working, but they were weak. The conventional weapons were still offline and there was no time to fix them. But the Cascade Drive showed green lights across the board. Lisa paused and then admitted that she still had no idea what those green lights actually meant. The weapon could be ready to fire or it could be ready to explode. There was no way to know until they tried it. Paul spoke up from the navigation station. He had plotted a course that would take them from the Mars orbital graveyard to Earth in just under 12 hours. That would give them 6 hours to prepare before the Valorians showed up. It was cutting things close, but there was no other option. Jake looked around at his crew. 12 people on a ship designed for 200. 12 people with an experimental weapon that nobody understood. 12 people who were supposed to save Earth from 300 alien warships. The odds were terrible, but Jake had learned a long time ago that odds did not matter when you had no other choice. He gave the order to move out. The Harbinger's engines came to life with a deep rumble that shook the entire ship. The old warship pulled away from the graveyard and pointed itself toward Earth. Red warning lights flashed on every console. Alarms beeped about systems that were not working properly. The ship groaned and creaked like it might fall apart at any moment. But it was moving, and that was enough. As they traveled toward Earth, Danny kept studying the Cascade drive. He called Jake over to look at something strange. The weapon was showing energy readings even though it was not turned on yet. The power was coming from somewhere, but Danny could not figure out where. It was not the reactor. It was not the batteries. It was something else entirely. Something outside the ship. Something that existed in a place that their sensors could not detect. Jake asked if that was dangerous. Danny said he did not know. Everything about the Cascade drive was dangerous. They were playing with technology that humanity did not understand and probably should not be using. But what choice did they have? The Valorians were not going to stop. They were not going to show mercy. They were coming to conquer Earth and enslave or kill every human being alive. If the Cascade drive was dangerous, then so be it. Sometimes you had to use dangerous things to survive. The Valorian Grand Armada came out of hyperspace like a storm of metal and death. 300 warships appeared all at once. Each ship was massive and covered with weapons. Their hulls were dark and shimmered with energy shields. The biggest ship was called the Emperor's Wrath, and it was larger than Earth's moon. Jake watched them appear on the Harbinger's sensors and felt his stomach tighten. He had known they were coming, but seeing them was different. This was real now. This was happening. Admiral Kate Sullivan's face appeared on the communication screen. She looked terrible. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep and her face was pale. She told Jake that the outer defense platforms had stopped responding. The Valorians were using some kind of disruption field that cut through communications and targeting systems, like they were not even there. The human fleet was scattered and outmatched. They were buying time, but not much of it. Sullivan looked directly at Jake and told him the truth. She was sending him out there because she had no other options left. If the Cascade drive worked, then he should use it. If it did not work, then at least Earth would go down fighting. The communication ended. Jake looked at his crew. Paul was at navigation. Lisa was watching the reactor. Nicole was at communications. Danny was at the weapons station. 12 people total on a ship that should have 200. 12 people who were about to face 300 alien warships. Jake took a deep breath and gave the orders. All hands to battle stations. Paul would take them into the fight. Nicole would try to find the Valorian command structure. Danny would charge the Cascade drive and get it ready to fire. The Harbinger moved forward. Its old engines pushed the ship toward the Valorian fleet at high speed. The hull shook and groaned. Red warning lights flashed everywhere. But the ship kept moving. It kept accelerating. It was heading straight into the enemy formation like a missile. Nicole suddenly spoke up. The Valorians had spotted them. Multiple enemy ships were locking their weapons onto the Harbinger. Then she said something else. The Valorians were hailing them. They wanted to talk. Jake told her to put them through. The face that appeared on screen was almost human, but not quite. The skin was gray. The eyes glowed with purple light. There were ridges on the face that made it look both beautiful and cruel. This was High Commander Jathik of the Valorian Empire. Jathik looked amused. A single human vessel was approaching their Grand Armada. How quaint, how desperate. Jathik asked if Jake was here to surrender Earth or simply to die with ceremony. Jake leaned forward in his chair. He said neither. He was here to give the Valorians one chance to turn around and leave human space. Jathik laughed. The sound echoed through the bridge. The Valorian said that humans had such adorable arrogance. Very well. Jathik would add Jake's ship to the wreckage they left in orbit around Earth. The screen went dark. Nicole shouted a warning. Incoming fire. Energy beams shot through space toward the Harbinger. Each beam was powerful enough to destroy a cruiser instantly. Paul threw the ship into a spin. The old warship moved with unexpected grace. The beams missed by only a few meters. The heat from them still made the hull plates glow red. Danny called out from weapons. The Cascade drive was charged to 80%, but he was seeing strange readings. The weapon was pulling power from somewhere other than their reactor. He could not identify the source. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere outside normal space. Jake asked if Danny could fire the weapon. Danny said yes, but he could not predict what would happen. Nobody knew what would really happen. They had never fired this thing at a real target before. Jake gripped the armrests of his chair. His knuckles turned white. He gave the order. Target the Emperor's Wrath, the flagship, the biggest ship in the enemy fleet. Fire the Cascade Drive. The Harbinger shuddered like it had been hit. Every light on the bridge went out. The screens went dark. The hum of the engines stopped. For 3 long seconds they floated in complete darkness and complete silence. Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then through the viewports he saw something impossible. A beam of light that was not really light. It moved through space like a crack spreading through glass. Reality itself seemed to break apart around it. The beam was wrong. It hurt to look at. It made Jake's eyes water and his head ache. When the beam touched the Emperor's Wrath, the massive flagship simply stopped existing. There was no explosion. There was no flash of light. There was no debris. One moment the ship was there. The next moment it was gone. Just empty space where it had been. Nothing remained. Not even atoms. Lisa whispered a question. What did we just do? Nobody answered because nobody knew. The Valorian fleet hung motionless in space. 300 warships suddenly had no leader. Their command structure had been erased in an instant. But something else was happening. Alarms started wailing on the Harbinger. Danny shouted over the noise. The Cascade Drive was still active. It was not shutting down. The energy readings were climbing higher and higher. Lisa worked frantically at her console. The weapon was not drawing power from their reactor anymore. It was pulling energy from somewhere else, from that unknown place outside normal space. She could not stop it. Through the viewport, space itself began to ripple. The area where the Emperor's Wrath had been was distorting. Waves of invisible force spread outward like ripples in water. Nicole reported that the Valorian fleet was breaking formation. They were trying to retreat. Their ships were turning around and firing their engines at full power. But something was wrong. The ships nearest to where the flagship had been were losing power. Their lights were going out. Their engines were dying. Jake gave Paul an urgent order. Get us away from here. Full power on the engines now. The Harbinger's engines roared back to life. The ship accelerated away from the distortion. But the effect was spreading faster than they could move. Valorian warships caught in the expanding field began to disappear. One after another they winked out of existence. No explosions, no debris. They were just gone. Lisa stared at her readings and her face went pale. She said it was a chain reaction. The weapon had created a cascading effect in whatever strange dimension it touched. The effect was spreading through space itself like a wave. It was unstable and growing. Kevin called up from engineering. He had noticed something important. The cascading effect was following a pattern. It was targeting Valorian energy signatures specifically. Their ship was being ignored. The effect was passing right by the Harbinger without touching it. In less than 10 minutes it was over. The entire Valorian Grand Armada was gone. 300 warships that had conquered a dozen star systems had been erased from existence. The space around Earth was empty except for the Harbinger and the scattered remains of humanity's defense fleet. Jake sat in his chair and tried to process what had just happened. His hands were shaking. His crew was silent. Nobody knew what to say. Admiral Sullivan's face appeared on the communication screen again. She looked stunned. Her mouth was open, but no words came out at first. Finally, she asked what had happened out there. Jake told her the truth. He said he was not entirely sure. The Valorian fleet was gone. Sullivan asked if he meant destroyed. Jake shook his head. No, Admiral. Not destroyed, gone, as in ceased to exist. There was no debris. There were no energy signatures. There was no trace that 300 warships had ever been there. The silence on the other end of the communication lasted a long time. Then Sullivan spoke again, but her voice was careful now. She said they were detecting unusual readings from the Harbinger's position. She asked if the crew was safe. Jake looked around the bridge. His people were shaken but alive. The ship's systems were stabilizing. The Cascade Drive had finally powered down. Whatever mysterious energy source it had been using had cut off as suddenly as it appeared. Jake told the Admiral they were intact and requested permission to return to dock. Sullivan granted permission, but she said they needed to have a very long conversation about that weapon. As the Harbinger began moving back toward Mars orbit, Danny spoke up from the weapons station. He had managed to pull some data from the Cascade Drive before it shut down. He said Jake needed to see something. Jake walked over to look at the display. The readings made no sense at first. There were energy patterns that should not exist. There were dimensional signatures that human science had no name for. Danny highlighted a specific section of the data. He pointed to a signature and said it was not from our universe. Jake asked what Danny meant. Danny took a deep breath and explained. The Cascade Drive did not destroy things. It opened a hole to somewhere else and pushed them through. The Valorian fleet was not destroyed. It was somewhere else entirely. In another dimension or another universe or some place that human physics could not describe. And according to the readings, the hole was still there. It was dormant, but it had not closed. It was still connected to wherever the Valorians had gone. Lisa heard this and came over to look at the data. Her face went pale as she read the numbers. She confirmed what Danny was saying. The weapon had torn a hole in reality itself. They had pushed 300 warships through that hole into some place unknown, and the hole was still open like a wound in space that had not healed. Over the next 3 weeks, Jake and his crew were questioned by every scientist and military official on Earth. The Harbinger was moved to a secure facility. Armed guards were posted around it at all times. Teams of researchers swarmed over every inch of the ship. They studied the Cascade Drive day and night. Dr. Laura Chen led the research team. She was the head of Earth's Dimensional Research Division. She confirmed that the weapon created breaches in dimensional space. The Valorian fleet had been displaced, not destroyed. But nobody knew where they went. The breach led to a space that could not be identified. It could be another dimension or another universe or something that human science had no framework to understand. What they did know was that the breach was stable and it was growing slowly. Each day it got a little bit bigger. Each day it pulled a little more energy from somewhere unknown. Then came the message from the Valorian Empire. It arrived 3 weeks after the battle. Jake was called to the United Earth Council chambers to hear it. The chamber was packed with officials and military brass. Everyone looked worried. Council Chairman Henry Blake played the recording. It was from the Valorian High Command. They said a new fleet was being assembled. They wanted their people back. They wanted the Harbinger destroyed. They were giving Earth 2 months to comply. If Earth refused, the new fleet would come and the Valorians would not show mercy this time. Blake turned off the recording and looked at Jake. He asked how big the new fleet would be. The intelligence report said 600 ships, twice the size of the Grand Armada. They would arrive in 2 months with weapons designed specifically to counter whatever the Harbinger had done. Blake's face was grim. The Valorians had also made something else clear. If Earth used the Cascade Drive again, they would consider it an act of dimensional warfare. They would respond accordingly. Nobody knew what that meant, but the tone of the message suggested something catastrophic. Lisa stood up. She had been allowed to attend the council meeting. She told them there was something else they needed to know. Her team had been monitoring the breach constantly. It was not just growing. It was resonating, like it was connected to other breaches somewhere in space. If they used the Cascade Drive again, they might not be able to control where the effect stopped. It might spread beyond the target. It might tear holes in reality across the entire solar system or beyond. The chamber erupted in argument. Some council members wanted to dismantle the Harbinger immediately. They said the weapon was too dangerous. It threatened not just Earth, but reality itself. Other officials insisted the Harbinger was humanity's only defense. Without it, the Valorian fleet would conquer Earth easily. Jake stood silent and listened to people debate the fate of his ship and crew. Finally, Blake called for order. He announced the council's decision. The Harbinger would remain operational but under strict oversight. Jake and his crew would work with the scientists to understand the Cascade Drive fully. If they were forced to use it again, they needed to know exactly what they were unleashing. They needed to understand the risks. Over the following weeks, the Harbinger became the center of Earth's defensive strategy. Engineers reinforced the hull. They upgraded the conventional weapons. They installed new sensor arrays to monitor dimensional activity. Jake's crew expanded to 50 people, but he kept his original 12 in the key positions. He trusted them. They had been through the fire together. Danny worked with Dr. Chen's team every day. They mapped the Cascade Drive's energy patterns. What they discovered was both amazing and terrifying. The weapon did not create energy. It borrowed energy from whatever existed beyond the breach. Every time they activated it, they were opening a door to something unknown. They were reaching into another place and taking its power without permission. One evening, Jake found Danny staring at a holographic display of the breach structure. Danny called him over. He said Jake needed to see something. The breach was not random. It had a pattern. It had structure. It looked almost like architecture, like something had been built on the other side. Danny said he did not think it was empty space beyond the breach. Jake asked if Danny was saying something lived there. Danny shook his head. He said something built there, and they had just thrown 300 Valorian warships into whatever it was. That night, Jake could not sleep. He walked through the corridors of the Harbinger past crew quarters, where tired engineers and scientists were still working. The ship felt different now. It felt alive in a way it had not been when they first found it in the graveyard. Maybe it had always been alive and they were only now realizing what they had awakened. Nicole found him on the observation deck staring at the stars. She asked if he was having trouble sleeping. Jake said he was just thinking. They had saved Earth, but at what cost? What if the Valorians were right to be afraid of what they had done? What if opening that breach was worse than losing a war? Nicole stood beside him. She said they did what they had to do. Sometimes that was all you could say. Jake asked what would happen if the Valorians came back with their new fleet. 600 ships, twice as many as before. Could they use the Cascade Drive again? Knowing what they knew now? Knowing that it might tear holes in reality that could never be closed. Nicole was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made Jake pause. She said the Valorians were not their biggest problem anymore. Whatever was on the other side of that breach, whatever they had disturbed by throwing warships into its space, that was the real threat now. The weeks passed quickly. The Valorian deadline was approaching. Earth's military prepared for war. New defense platforms were built. The fleet was reinforced with every ship that could fly, but everyone knew it would not be enough. 600 Valorian warships would overwhelm any defense humanity could build. The only real weapon they had was the Harbinger, and using it might destroy more than just the enemy. Jake spent his days training with the expanded crew. He spent his nights reviewing the data from the breach. The more he learned, the more worried he became. The breach was not just a hole in space. It was a doorway to somewhere that followed different rules. The energy signatures coming from it made no sense. They changed constantly. They pulsed with patterns that seemed almost like communication. 6 weeks after the first battle, something changed. Jake was on the bridge when the alarms went off. Dr. Chen's panicked face filled the communication screen. She said something was coming through the breach. Multiple massive signatures. They were not Valorian. Jake asked what they were. Chen said she did not know, but they were big. Bigger than anything humanity had ever encountered. Bigger than anything that should be able to exist. Within hours, the entities emerged. They were not ships. They were structures. Vast geometric forms that hurt to look at. They existed partially in normal space and partially in whatever dimension the breach connected to. Each one was the size of a small moon. They were made of angles that should not fit together. They were colored with shades that had no name. They moved in ways that defied physics. And behind them, streaming through the breach like prisoners escaping from a cage, came what remained of the Valorian Grand Armada. The Valorian ships were damaged badly. Their hulls were scarred with burns that looked like crystal. Their shields were gone. Their weapons were offline. They scattered immediately upon emerging. They fled in all directions at maximum speed. Most of them jumped to hyperspace as fast as their engines would allow. Only one ship stayed, a heavily damaged cruiser that transmitted a message before it too fled. High Commander Jothik's face appeared on the screen. The proud commander who had mocked Jake weeks earlier looked completely different now. Their gray skin was pale, almost white. Their glowing eyes were dim. Their face was marked with exhaustion and terror. Jothik spoke, and their voice was desperate. They called out to the human vessel. They begged Jake to close the breach. They had to seal it now. The Valorians had been fools to come to Earth, but what humans had done by opening the breach was far worse than any invasion. Humans had opened a door to the architects. Jake asked what the architects were. Jothik explained quickly. The architects were beings that existed between dimensions. They were the ones who built the spaces between spaces. The Cascade Drive had thrown the Valorian fleet into the architects' realm. The architects did not appreciate the intrusion. They did not appreciate having 300 warships dumped into their carefully constructed space. Now they had followed the Valorians back through the breach. They wanted it closed. If it could not be closed, They would close it themselves by destroying everything on this side of it. The geometric forms began to move. They positioned themselves around the breach in a pattern that made Jake's head hurt to watch. Energy built around them. It was visible as a distortion in space that made his eyes water. The air on the bridge felt heavy and wrong. Lisa called out from her station. She was reading massive energy spikes from the entities. If they released that energy, it would destabilize the entire sector. Earth and Mars and everything in the solar system would be caught in the blast. It would be like a supernova, but worse. It would tear holes in reality across thousands of light years. Jake made a decision. He told Danny to charge the Cascade drive, target the breach itself. Paul protested. They did not know what would happen if they fired into the breach. It could make things worse. It could open more holes. It could spread the damage across the galaxy. Jake knew Paul was right. But if those entities released their energy, everyone would die anyway. At least this way they had a chance. He gave the order. Danny started the charging sequence. The Cascade drive hummed to life. It drew power from that mysterious elsewhere. But this time Jake could feel something different. There was a presence on the other side of the weapon. Something vast and ancient and aware. The architects were not just existing in another dimension. They were watching. They had always been watching. They knew what humans were doing. Danny reported the weapon was ready. Jake took a deep breath and gave the order to fire. The beam lanced out toward the breach. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the breach began to collapse. It folded in on itself like a wound healing. The geometric forms flickered. Their energy discharge was interrupted. But instead of attacking, the architects paused. One of the forms shifted and suddenly Jake understood something. They were not trying to destroy Earth, they were trying to close the breach themselves. That was what the energy buildup was for. They were going to seal the doorway the only way they knew how, by overwhelming it with power. The Harbinger's weapon and the Architect's power merged together. Two forces trying to do the same thing. Two different methods working toward the same goal. The energy created a feedback loop that accelerated the breach's collapse. Space twisted and bent in ways that made no sense. Reality folded like paper. Then, with a soundless implosion that Jake felt in his bones, the dimensional tier sealed itself completely. It was gone. The doorway to that other place was closed. The architects vanished instantly. They were pulled back into their realm as the breach disappeared. The geometric forms flickered one last time, and then they were gone. The Valorian ships that had not already fled jumped to hyperspace immediately. Within minutes, human space was empty except for Earth's defense fleet and the Harbinger floating alone in the void. The Cascade drive went dark. Its displays shut off one by one. The mysterious energy source that had powered it cut off permanently. Danny checked the systems and confirmed what Jake already suspected. The weapon was dead. Whatever connection it had to that other dimension was severed. The Cascade drive would never fire again. In the days that followed, Earth and the Valorian Empire opened negotiations. Neither side wanted to continue fighting. The Valorians had seen what existed beyond the breach, and they wanted nothing to do with it. Humans had seen how close they came to destroying not just themselves, but reality itself. A treaty was signed within 2 weeks. The Valorians agreed never to return to human space. They would leave Earth alone permanently. Humanity agreed to dismantle the Cascade drive and seal all research into dimensional weapons. Both sides agreed that some doors should never be opened. Some powers should never be used. Admiral Sullivan personally oversaw the decommissioning of the Harbinger. Engineers carefully removed the Cascade drive's core. Scientists cataloged every component. Everything was documented and then locked away in the deepest vault humanity had. The information would be preserved but never used. Future generations would know what had been built and what had happened. They would know why it must never be built again. Jake stood on the bridge one last time as the work was being done. Sullivan stood beside him looking at the empty weapon station where Danny had sat during the battle. She said it was strange. This ship had saved humanity twice. Once by being powerful enough to stop an invasion. Once by being wise enough to help undo what it had done. Jake nodded.
He asked what would happen to the ship now.
Sullivan said it would go back to the graveyard, but this time it would go with full honors. The Harbinger would be preserved as a monument, a reminder of the day humanity learned that some weapons were too powerful to wield. Some victories cost too much. As Jake prepared to leave the bridge for the last time, Danny came running up. He said Jake needed to wait. He had found something during the final systems check. A message hidden in the Cascade Drive's memory banks. It had been encoded in patterns that human computers could not read. Not until after the breach was sealed. Only then did the message become visible. Jake asked what it said. Danny handed him a data tablet. The message had been translated into human language by their computers. It was simple and clear. The message said they were the architects. They built the spaces between. The door humans opened was not theirs to open, but humans had shown wisdom in closing it. The architects would watch humanity with interest. Humans should not seek them again, but the architects would remember the choice that was made. Some doors once closed should remain so. Jake stared at the message for a long time. Then he smiled, but it was a grim smile. He told Danny to make sure the monument included a warning. Something about how humanity's greatest victory came from knowing when to stop fighting, knowing when to show mercy, knowing when to choose understanding over destruction. Danny said he would pass that along. Then he paused and called Jake by a new title. Admiral Morrison. Jake raised an eyebrow. He asked what Danny meant. Danny explained that command had promoted him. They said anyone who could save Earth twice in 2 months deserved a bigger command, a more important position, though Danny doubted any ship would ever be as interesting as the Harbinger. Jake looked around the bridge one last time. The Harbinger had been called a failure, a prototype too dangerous for service, a weapon too unpredictable to deploy, but in the end it had proven to be exactly what humanity needed, not because it was powerful. Power alone would have destroyed everything. The Harbinger had saved Earth because it taught humanity an important lesson. Sometimes the most powerful weapon was not the one that destroyed your enemies. It was the one that made you wise enough to know when to show mercy, when to stand down, when to choose peace over annihilation. As the Harbinger drifted back to its resting place among the orbital graveyard above Mars, Jake walked away. He was Admiral Morrison now. He would command larger ships. He would lead more crew. He would face new challenges. But he would never forget the lessons learned on that old prototype warship, the ignored ship that changed everything. Humanity had faced an overwhelming enemy and won. But the real victory was not in destroying the Valorian fleet. The real victory was in understanding that some powers should not be used. Some doors should not be opened. Some weapons were too dangerous to exist. Earth scientists estimated that if the breach had remained open for another week, it would have grown beyond control. It would have torn holes across the galaxy. Reality itself would have begun to unravel. Humanity had come within days of destroying not just themselves but countless other civilizations. The treaty with the Valorians held strong. Neither side wanted war anymore. Both had seen what existed in the spaces between dimensions. Both had learned that there were worse things than losing a battle. There were worse fates than defeat. As years passed, the story of the Harbinger became legend. Children learned about it in school. The ship that saved Earth by teaching humanity wisdom. The weapon that won by showing mercy. The crew that changed history not through violence but through understanding. Jake went on to serve Earth for many more years. He commanded fleets and won battles and helped negotiate peace with species that had once been enemies. But he never forgot those desperate hours on the Harbinger. He never forgot the feeling of unleashing a power he did not understand. He never forgot the choice he made to close the breach rather than use the weapon again. And somewhere in the orbital graveyard above Mars, the Harbinger waited in silence, a monument to wisdom, a reminder of the day humanity learned its greatest lesson. Power without wisdom leads to destruction. Victory without mercy leads to tragedy. The strongest weapon is the one you choose not to use. The ignored prototype warship had indeed obliterated the grand armada of the Empire. But more importantly, it had given humanity something far more valuable than military victory. It had given them wisdom. And in the end, that wisdom would prove more powerful than any weapon ever built.